12-year-old black boy stands up in the middle of a courtroom. His small voice cuts through the heavy silence, catching everyone's attention. The judge looks annoyed, frowning at the interruption, but then the boy speaks, just 2 simple words. And in that moment, the judge's face turns pale. His hands tremble slightly, and the entire courtroom goes silent. What did the boy say? And why did it shake the judge to his core? Before we dive in, tell us where you're watching from. Stay till the end. You won't believe this twist. The courtroom was full. People sat quietly, some whispering, while lawyers shuffled papers. At the front was Judge Robert Hale, a man known for being strict and serious. He didn't smile much, and seemed like someone who had already made up his mind before hearing the full story. In the crowd sat Jaden, a 12-year-old black boy. He was small, with sharp eyes that noticed everything. He was there because his mother was on trial. Jaden's mother, Lisa, stood beside her lawyer. She looked tired but strong. She was being charged with something small, something that shouldn't have even gone to court. But Judge Hale didn't seem to care. He kept cutting off her lawyer, acting like he was too busy to listen. It was clear. He had already decided. Jaden sat quietly, watching the judge. His hands were tight fists in his lap. His heart was beating fast, and then he couldn't stay quiet any longer. Jaden stood up, his voice loud and clear. The whole courtroom went silent. Everyone turned to look at him. The judge frowned, clearly annoyed. "Sit down, boy. This is a court of law." But Jaden didn't sit. He looked straight at the judge, his voice strong and steady, and said 2 simple words. In that moment, the judge's face turned pale. The room went silent. Everyone stared at Jaden. Judge Hale's eyes narrowed, his face turning red with frustration. "I said, sit down," he barked, slamming his gavel. But Jaden didn't flinch. He didn't sit. He stood tall, looked the judge straight in the eyes, and said 2 words, "I remember." Those words hit Judge Hale like a punch. His face froze and the color drained from it. His hand, still gripping the gavel, trembled slightly. The courtroom didn't just go silent. It felt like time had stopped. Judge Hale tried to regain control. "What did you say?" His voice was quieter now, but not with authority, with fear. Jaden didn't back down. "I remember," he repeated, his voice steady. People in the courtroom exchanged confused glances. The lawyers, the audience, even the guards. They could all feel that something had changed. The judge cleared his throat, trying to act like nothing was wrong. "This is a courtroom, not a place for outbursts. Sit down, or I'll have you removed." But Jaden didn't move. "Do you remember me?" he asked softly. The judge's face went pale, because he did. Suddenly, it wasn't just Jaden standing there. It was a memory, one the judge had buried deep, a memory from years ago, when Jaden was just a little boy, clutching his father's hand in the same courtroom. Jaden's father had stood before Judge Hale, pleading for fairness. But the judge had dismissed him, just like he was dismissing Jaden's mother now. Back then, it had been just another case to the judge. But to Jaden, it was the day he lost his father. Jaden's voice broke the silence again. "You sent my dad away for something he didn't do." The room filled with whispers. People leaned in, curious and shocked. The judge's hands shook slightly. "That has nothing to do with today's case." Jaden's eyes didn't blink. "It has everything to do with it." Lisa's lawyer, confused but sensing the shift, stepped back, letting Jaden speak. Jaden continued, his voice calm but strong. "You didn't care about the truth then, and you don't care now." The judge tried to interrupt, but his words stumbled. For the first time, he wasn't in control. Jaden took a deep breath. "I was 5 when I watched you send my dad to prison. Now, I'm watching you do the same thing to my mom. But this time, I'm not too small to speak. The judge's face showed cracks, his mask of power slipping. The courtroom wasn't looking at him with respect anymore. They were looking at him with judgment. A woman in the back whispered, "Is that true?" Another person muttered, "How many families has he done this to?" Judge Hale's voice shook when he finally spoke. "This case is about your mother, not the past." Jaden's reply was simple. "It's all connected." The judge tried to regain control, tapping his gavel again. "Order in the court," he shouted. But his voice didn't carry the same power anymore. Jaden's courage had shifted the room. People were no longer afraid to speak up. A man stood up from the back row. "I remember you too, Judge Hale. You dismissed my brother's case without even reading the file." Another voice added, "And my cousin spent years in jail because of a mistake you refused to fix." The courtroom was no longer silent. It was filled with voices, voices that had been quiet for too long. Judge Hale's face turned from pale to red. "Enough!" he yelled, slamming his gavel hard. But no one stopped. Jaden stood tall, his voice clear over the noise. "You can't silence us. Not anymore." The judge stared at him, breathing heavily. He looked around the courtroom, realizing that the authority he had always counted on was gone. Jaden took a step forward. "You always thought people like us didn't matter. But we do, and today you're going to listen." The judge opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. For the first time, he had no words. Jaden's mother, Lisa, stood beside her son, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. Her eyes were filled with tears, not of sadness, but of pride. The courtroom slowly grew quiet again, not because the judge demanded it, but because everyone was waiting to hear what Jaden would say next. Jaden looked at the judge one last time. "I remember what you did. And now, so does everyone else." Judge Hale's gavel rested on the desk, untouched, because the real judgment had already been made. The courtroom was silent, the tension so thick it felt like the very air had stopped moving. Judge Hale sat frozen, his face pale, his grip on authority slipping with every word Jaden had spoken. Jaden stood tall, his gaze steady, locked on the judge. "I remember what you did to my dad," he said again, his voice echoing through the room. Judge Hale shifted in his seat, clearing his throat as if that would steady his voice. It didn't. "This isn't about the past," he finally managed, his voice shaky. "We're here to discuss your mother's case." Jaden didn't even blink. "That's where you're wrong. This is about the past, the present, and the future. Because what you did to my dad, you're doing the same thing to my mom. And I won't let that happen." The judge's face twitched. His hands, once firm on the gavel, trembled slightly. Whispers rippled through the crowd. A woman leaned toward her neighbor. "He's right. The judge has done this before." Jaden stepped closer, his voice cutting through the murmurs like a blade. "You didn't listen to my dad when he begged you to hear the truth. You sent him away like he was nothing. And you were wrong." The judge's jaw clenched. He slammed his gavel, trying to drown out the growing wave of voices. "Enough! This is my courtroom." But Jaden didn't flinch. His next words were soft, but they hit harder than any shout. "Not today." The judge's words died in his throat. His eyes darted around the room, searching for support, but all he saw were faces filled with judgment, not for Jaden, but for him. Lisa, Jaden's mother, stood beside her son, tears welling in her eyes. But they weren't tears of fear. They were tears of pride. Jaden continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "You thought my dad's life didn't matter. You think my mom's life doesn't matter. But we do." The judge tried again, his voice louder but no longer powerful. "You don't understand how the law works." Jaden cut him off. "I understand enough to know when it's being used to hurt people, instead of help them. The judge had no response. He glanced at the crowd again, hoping for someone to defend him. But no one did. A man in the back stood up, his voice clear and angry. "Judge Hale, you did the same to my brother. You never even looked at the evidence." Another woman's voice followed. "My cousin begged you to listen, and you didn't care. He lost everything because of you." Voices rose from every corner of the room. People were no longer afraid to speak. Judge Hale slammed his gavel again, the sound sharp but powerless. "Order! This is my courtroom." But the gavel's echo was weak compared to the voices rising around him. Jaden's voice cut through the noise one last time, clear and strong. "No, it's not your courtroom. It's our lives." The judge leaned back in his chair, his face drained of all color. The power he had held for so long was gone. Jaden turned to the crowd, his voice softer now but filled with strength. "We deserve justice. All of us. Not just when it's easy, but especially when it's hard." The judge opened his mouth as if to speak, but there was nothing left to say. His words had lost their weight. The courtroom grew quiet again, not because the judge demanded it, but because everyone was waiting for Jaden to finish. Jaden looked back at Judge Hale, his eyes steady. "You were supposed to stand for justice, but instead you stood for power. That's why we're here. That's why you're afraid right now, because you know I'm right." The judge's hands fell from the gavel, resting uselessly on the bench. Jaden's mother reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. In that moment it was clear. Jaden had won. Not through shouting, not through anger, but through the truth. The judge finally spoke, his voice hollow. I was just doing my job." Jaden shook his head. "No, you were doing what was easy. Justice isn't easy." The room was silent again, but it wasn't the judge's courtroom anymore. It belonged to Jaden. The judge stood up, but he didn't look powerful. He looked small. He glanced around, seeing faces filled with disappointment, frustration, and truth. The truth he had ignored for years. Jaden's last words echoed in the room long after he sat back down. "You can't hide from the truth forever. It always catches up." And for Judge Hale, the truth had finally caught him. The courtroom was silent, heavy with tension. Judge Hale stood there, his face pale, his authority crumbling right before everyone's eyes. The power he thought he owned had slipped away, piece by piece, with every word Jaden spoke. Jaden's words echoed in the judge's mind. "You can't hide from the truth forever." For years, Judge Hale had worn his robe like a shield, using it to protect himself from the consequences of his decisions. But today, that shield was gone. Today, he was exposed. After a long, uncomfortable silence, Judge Hale finally spoke. His voice was shaky, no longer carrying the weight it once did. "I was just following the law," he muttered, his eyes darting around, avoiding Jaden's gaze. Jaden didn't blink. "The law isn't supposed to hurt people. It's supposed to protect them." The judge swallowed hard, his throat dry. He knew Jaden was right. But then came the twist no one expected. Jaden reached into his pocket and pulled out an old, crumpled photo. It was a picture of him as a little boy, standing next to his dad outside the courthouse years ago, the day his father was sentenced. Jaden held the photo up. "Do you remember this day?" The judge's face went from pale to ghostly white, because he did remember. It wasn't just another case, not to him. It was the day he made a choice to ignore the truth because it was easier than facing it. "You knew my dad was innocent," Jaden whispered, his voice trembling now, not from fear, but from emotion. "You had the evidence, but you didn't care." The judge opened his mouth, but no words came out, because there was nothing left to say. Tears welled up in Jaden's eyes, but he didn't let them fall. "You didn't just take my dad away. You took away my family, my childhood, my peace." The judge finally sat down, his legs too weak to hold him up. The man who had sent so many people away with a simple slam of his gavel was now drowning in his own guilt. But Jaden wasn't finished. "You can't fix what you did to my dad, but you can make it right today. Right now, with my mom." The judge's hands trembled as he picked up his gavel, not with the power he once had, but with the weight of his mistakes. He looked at Jaden's mother, then back at Jaden. His voice was barely a whisper. "I'm sorry." The apology was small. It wasn't enough to undo the past, but it was a start. With a deep breath, Judge Hale dismissed the case against Jaden's mother. The charges were dropped. The courtroom erupted, not with cheers but with something heavier: relief, justice, closure. Jaden stood still, his heart racing. Not because he had won, but because he had been heard. As people began to leave, Judge Hale remained seated, staring at the photo Jaden had left on the bench. Because sometimes the real punishment isn't a prison sentence. It's living with the truth. The courtroom slowly emptied, but Judge Hale remained in his seat, staring blankly at the photo Jaden had left behind. For the first time in his career, the gavel in his hand felt heavier than ever. Not with power, but with guilt. Jaden stood beside his mother, holding her hand tightly. The case was over, but the feeling wasn't victory. It was something deeper. It was justice, not just for his mother, but for his father, and for all the people the judge had dismissed without care. As they walked out of the courtroom, Jaden didn't look back, because he didn't need to. The truth had been spoken, and that truth would stay with Judge Hale far longer than any courtroom verdict. Later that day, Judge Hale sat alone in his chambers. The silence was deafening. No lawyers, no staff, no courtroom chatter, just the echo of Jaden's words. "You can't hide from the truth forever." Those words haunted him, not because they were loud, but because they were true. He thought back to all the cases he'd rushed through, all the people he'd judged without truly listening. It was never just about Jaden's family. It was about every family. Meanwhile, Jaden and his mother walked home, the weight of fear finally lifting from their shoulders. His mother squeezed his hand gently. "You were so brave," she whispered. Jaden shook his head. "I wasn't brave. I was just tired of being quiet." His words held power, not because they were spoken loudly, but because they came from the heart. Weeks passed, but the ripple effect of that day in the court didn't fade. The case had made headlines. "Boy stands up to judge, exposes years of injustice." People started talking, not just about Jaden's courage, but about the system itself. Judge Hale eventually resigned. Not because he was forced to, but because he couldn't sit on that bench knowing he had failed so many people. But here's the thing. This story isn't just about a boy and a judge. It's about what happens when someone refuses to stay silent. Jaden didn't need to shout. He didn't need to fight. He just needed to speak the truth. And sometimes that's enough to change everything. So, what do you think? Can one voice really make a difference? Let me know in the comments. And if this story made you think, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories, because stories like this, they need to be heard. And just like that, the story of a 12-year-old boy standing up in a courtroom wasn't just about him anymore. It became a story about courage, truth, and what happens when one voice refuses to be silenced. Jaden didn't have power. He didn't have authority. But what he had was something stronger, the courage to speak the truth. His words didn't just shake a judge. They exposed years of injustice, inspired change, and reminded everyone watching that sometimes, It only takes 2 words to make the whole world stop and listen. But here's the real question. Do you believe one voice can change the world? Would you have spoken up if you were in Jaden's shoes? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear what you think. And if this story made you feel something, hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories that matter. Because stories like Jaden's, they're not just stories, they're reminders that the truth will always find its voice. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.